It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Sergeant Davy Jones, 71, realized his world was about to crumble over a faded registration sticker on his van. Parked outside the local Veterans Outreach Center, the van wasn't just transportation, it was his home. A 25-year Marine Corps veteran, Davy had come to depend entirely on the battered 1990 camper he affectionately called the Wanderer after losing traditional housing. Inside, it held all he owned: a folded sleeping bag, a framed photo of his late daughter, a well-worn Bible, and carefully packed sandwiches. He survived each month on his disability pension, enough for food and gas, but not for costly registration fees. That morning, Officer Miller arrived, rigid and unsympathetic. He barked, "That vehicle is illegally parked with expired tags. You have 10 minutes to move it, or I'll tow it." Fear and frustration surged through Davy as he gripped his walker. In a voice roughened by age and exhaustion, he explained, "I'm working with the VA to renew the registration. This is my home." But Miller, only 5 years into the force, remained unmoved. He issued citations for both the expired plates and parking violation. In that moment, two pillars of Davy's dignity, his independence and his modest sanctuary, were threatened. As the 10 minutes ticked down, Davy could hear his own heartbeat louder than distant traffic. He mustered courage and said softly, "I'm a veteran, a Marine. I served 25 years. Please, I need more time." Miller's expression remained cold. "Your service doesn't exempt you from the law," he replied, arms crossed, unwilling to show compassion. The harshness of those words cut deeper than any combat wound. Davy had faced enemy fire. Now he felt powerless on a city street, helpless as his life could be towed away within minutes. Despair threatened to overwhelm him as he stared at the ticket. The van's engine was unreliable, retrieval costs were astronomical, and he had nowhere else to go. The weight of bureaucracy bore down. Yet buried beneath the humiliation, a spark of old Marine discipline flickered, resilience forged in hardship and adversity. With trembling resolve, Davy retrieved a contact saved years ago from an officer he respected deeply. He hesitated. Time had passed, and the request felt presumptuous, but this was bigger than pride. This was a moment that demanded courage of another kind, the courage to reach out when the system failed him. So he pressed call, aware this moment could become a test of whether a community and a nation truly honor those who served. The phone rang twice before the familiar commanding voice of General Alistair Kaine came through. "Davy," the general said, voice steady yet concerned, "sit tight. Don't let anyone tow the Wanderer. Help is on its way." The words hit Davy like a lifeline. Validation, dignity, compassion. His trembling fingers gripped the cell phone as he whispered, "Yes, sir." The rumble of the military convoy in the distance grew louder, hope manifesting in steel and resolve. Moments later, Sergeant Davy Jones found himself standing on a quiet cul-de-sac, flashlights piercing the dusk. A small group of National Guard Humvees and MRAPs had formed a protective circle around his battered camper van. Waves of olive-drab metal and disciplined movement replaced the threat of towing. On the front seat of the lead targeting vehicle sat General Kaine himself, his presence unmistakable. Officer Miller, momentarily cowed, found himself face-to-face with a man twice his age and still bristling with authority. Kaine stepped from Davy looked from the general to his crumbling camper van. Tears threatened as he responded, "Sir, it means more than I can say." The general, then Kaine, shook his head slowly. "This soldier's nominal status doesn't suspend city laws. But compassion should never be optional." Amid the quiet tension, Kaine used his phone again. Soon, the chief of police, VA outreach workers, and the mayor arrived at the scene. Kaine briefed them in a tight-lipped, no-nonsense tone, laying out simple facts. A 25-year H&S Marine veteran, disabled, living in his camper while awaiting VA housing, now threatened with losing his only shelter. The officials shifted uncomfortably. The chief apologized publicly, and after 2 hours spent coordinating care, Kaine joined Davy by the van's doorway. Inside, the camper felt like a mini-museum of sacrifice. A tattered Marine Corps flag draped beside a small altar to Davy's fallen comrades, and a paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea resting atop the sleeping bag. Kaine gently asked, "How about we get you someplace warm tonight?" Before stepping in, Davy saluted Kaine, voice cracking with gratitude. "Semper Fi, General." Kaine returned the gesture, eyes glistening. "Always, Sergeant." "Staggy." The two shared a brief nod as Davy climbed into the waiting van. As the convoy dispersed through the cul-de-sac, neighbors who had witnessed the scene offered waves and soft applause. Davy turned to watch them go. That night, Davy slept. He wasn't just one Marine among many. He was a man. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a sharp contrast to the turmoil of the previous day. Sergeant David "Davy" Jones, seated at a modest breakfast table in his temporary VA housing, looked down at a stack of housing forms and aid applications spread before him. Every line represented not just paperwork, but a lifeline. Only yesterday he'd nearly lost the only home he'd known, and that memory still ached more sharply than his old combat injuries. But this morning, he felt something new stirring in his chest, cautious hope. As he methodically filled out each form, his mind drifted back to yesterday's events. The rumble of MRAPs, the presence of a retired general commanding authority in his defense, the public apology from the city, all of it had delivered more than shelter. It had delivered recognition that the government and community could indeed rally for one of their own. But tasks remained. Today, his mission was to build a stable future, brick by brick, form by form. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A young caseworker, Carmen Alvarez, stepped in, her eyes warm and her demeanor professional. She introduced herself and handed him a folder of supportive documents, rental applications, veterans preference notices, and a list of affordable housing options nearby. Carmen promised to personally accompany him to appointments that afternoon. Davy nodded, gratitude softening his lined face. Just one day earlier, he'd felt invisible. Today, he was being seen. After breakfast, they set out together to meet a landlord at a small duplex just a few blocks away. The unit was clean, modestly furnished, and priced within his budget. As they toured the space, a living room with sunlight spilling through sheer curtains, a small kitchen with room for a table, the landlord, Mr. Thompson, asked simply, "You're a veteran?" Davy replied, 70 years old, served 25 in the Marines." The landlord paused, then nodded with respect. "Thank you for your service. I want you to feel at home." That handshake renewed something within Davy, confidence that humility and integrity could still open doors. Later, at the VA outreach office, Carmen guided him through health and benefits enrollment. Davy learned he qualified for additional PTSD services, physical therapy for his aging knees, and transportation assistance. Each approval letter he signed felt like another brick in a foundation, not just for housing, but for a life rebuilt. By mid-afternoon, Davy returned to the Wanderer parked in its new storage lot. He opened the door, inhaling the familiar scent of threadbare upholstery and memories. With his new housing on the horizon, the van was no longer a necessity, but he removed a tattered Marine Corps patch and the framed photo of his late daughter, placing both in his jacket pocket. It felt good to carry those symbols forward, rather than leave them behind. That evening, a small gathering was held at the VA guest house dining room. Carmen, Mr. Thompson, General Kaine, who had stayed in town, and a few fellow veterans he'd met during the outreach process. Davy stood, cane in hand, addressing the circle. "Yesterday, I was at the mercy of bureaucracy," he began, voice steady. "Today, I stand because people stepped up. I deserve shelter, and so do others among us." Applause followed, not loud, but honest. General Kaine clasped his shoulder. "You reminded us all, Davy. Service doesn't retire." Davy smiled, tired but unbroken. In that room, among helpers and peers, he felt a renewed purpose. To keep advocating, not just for himself, but for every veteran who quietly slid into obscurity. As the evening ended, Davy returned to his modest new apartment. He placed a small plaque on the mantel, Semper Fidelis. The words felt heavier now, the commitment not just to Corps, but to community. His journey was far from over, but the path was clear, and for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel impossible. The next morning began with sunlight spilling gently through his new apartment's window, a far cry from the cramped interior of the Wanderer. Sergeant David "Davy" Jones stirred awake, Kaine within arm's reach, and felt the unfamiliar comfort of a proper bed beneath him. Gone were the constant chill of steel and drafty walls. Instead, he breathed in fresh air, dusted with the faint aroma of brewed coffee from the kitchen. As he rose to prepare modest breakfast, 2 scrambled eggs with toast, he paused to reflect on how much had changed in just 3 days. Yet a bigger challenge lay ahead, ensuring this newfound stability didn't slip away. By 9 a.m., Carmen Alvarez arrived to help. Today, they would visit the local council office, where applications for rental assistance, property tax relief, and disability transportation passes were underway. Davy's fingers trembled slightly as he handed over documents, but Carmen's calm assurance steadied him. "You're doing great," she whispered. At the counter, the clerk nodded approvingly when he said, "Marine veteran, 25 years, PTSD and mobility issues." Their respect reminded him that dignity still mattered. Later that afternoon, General Kaine dropped by for an impromptu check-in. He greeted Davy with elderly but firm embrace and joined them for a walk through the nearby Veterans Garden. "How are you holding up?" Kaine asked. The general's presence still invoked gratitude and comfort in Davy, a reminder that his sacrifice resonated far beyond his own life. Davy nodded, scanning the lush greenery. "I'm good, sir, but I want to make sure this lasts, not just for me, but for others out there in vans." They paused on a bench overlooking a memorial fountain, and Kaine placed a steady hand on Davy's shoulder. "That's the Marine spirit, always thinking of the squad." By early evening, Davy was invited to speak at a community leadership meeting hosted in a nearby town hall. The room was packed with city officials, VA representatives, and neighbors of all ages. Though nervous, he stood tall, cane planted, voice strong. He recounted the journey, from near homelessness on the curb to the show of military solidarity, to finally securing housing. He emphasized how a single phone call had sparked real action, and how others must learn to advocate with quiet dignity. "Our veterans deserve to be seen," he said, "not just recognized with words at Memorial Day." Applause filled the room, and several officials later approached him, pledging funding to expand outreach and offer same-day housing vouchers when cries for help come in. Afterward, a group of retired veterans gathered in a quiet corner. They shared stories of their own struggles, financial, medical, emotional. Davy offered advice, to speak up early, to keep VA paperwork current, and to lean on community networks. A younger veteran told him, "You showed us how it's done." Davy nodded, humbled. "We have to look after each other." Later that night, Davy returned home and set up a simple desk in the living room. He began drafting a letter to his former Marine unit, urging them to share resources for homeless or at-risk veterans. He also started notes for an op-ed in the local paper titled, "When Service Rests, Dignity Stands." These were small acts, but he believed they could spark ripple effects. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., he paused to read from his worn Bible, comfort in Scripture, and salute to discipline. He placed it beside his Marine patch, touching them both with gentle pride. He whispered a promise, "Semper Fidelis always," before switching off the lamp. Through each step, breakfast, appointments, speeches, planning, Davy transformed pain into purpose. From the bench to the podium, he had rewritten his narrative, from nearly invisible to visibly impactful. His journey had come full circle. Once needing rescue, he was now guiding others toward rescue too. And while the road ahead remained long, he no longer faced it alone. In his quiet, unwavering way, Sergeant David Davy Jones had become more than a survivor. The sun was dipping low when Sergeant David Davy Jones returned to his apartment, a humble smile softening his features. In the quiet of his living room, he reflected on the whirlwind weeks, how a desperate call for help had sparked a convoy of support, how a name and story had turned into city-wide change. But more than victories, what resonated most was the simple truth. No one should lose their dignity while asking for help. Davy's journey taught him that courage isn't always about charging ahead. It can be about standing still long enough to be seen. It's in the moment you choose to quietly say, "I need this," even when fear, pride, or shame say otherwise. That moment, that voice, can ignite compassion, not just from a hero in uniform, but from an entire community ready to listen. He traced his fingers over his Marine Corps memorabilia, the patch on his jacket, the Bible on his nightstand. Each item was a reminder that service doesn't end when your tour ends. It continues in how you demand respect. He whispered a vow. Any fellow veteran struggling, he'd be there. When your world feels small and your value unseen, remember, it only takes one voice to start a movement of care. Your dignity matters. Let compassion follow when you share your truth. If Sergeant Davy's story moved you, type honor in the comments and share a time you stood up for someone's worth. Don't forget to subscribe. Let's lift stories of courage, resilience, and respect together.